A World History of Christianity, Chapter 9, Part 2. We're in the middle of page 341. It was, however, not Cuzco, with its surviving assertion of Inca self-awareness, but Lima, which was determinative of the character of the church. When Archbishop de Mogrovejo called together the Third Peruvian Provincial Church Council in 1581, he appointed as its chief theologian a distinguished Jesuit named José de Acosta, who had been in Lima for the last 10 years, where he had lectured in the university and served as Jesuit provincial superior. Acosta is an important figure, in many ways the antithesis of Las Casas, and his intellectual influence was almost as great, due to the publication of his highly impressive Historia Natural y Moral de las Indias in 1590, a work quickly translated into all the main languages of Europe. Acosta, despite huge knowledge of the New World, especially its natural history and material conditions, took a far more pessimistic view of Indian society than did Las Casas. The devil was once more in the middle of the picture. Moreover, unlike Las Casas, he had no time for the claim that the Pope could grant jurisdiction over infidel kingdoms to anyone at all. For him, the establishment of Spanish rule was essentially a matter of brute force. On an Augustinian perspective, every kingdom was achieved by violence. The Spanish, no more and no less than the Inca or the Aztec. The point for him was that by the 1580s, it was all a fait accompli. The Spaniards ruled the New World, and it was simply within that context that one had now to think, building up the church, kindly but firmly. He had little criticism to offer of current government policy, believed it would be a mistake to ordain Indians to the priesthood, but would support their admission to the Eucharist. For Acosta, the Spanish conquest was unquestionably a providential development, assisted even supernaturally. The 1581 Provincial Council had pronounced that all who dwelt in Peru prior to the Spanish conquest were children of Satan and sentenced to eternal damnation. Acosta had himself been active in securing the condemnation of a Dominican, Francisco de la Cruz, who had taught just the opposite. If Las Casas may be judged the winner in the long-term intellectual debate, Acosta almost certainly won the immediate battle in terms of ecclesiastical life. Indian Christianity would survive, despite regular hammering for its retention of idols, but the church as institution would remain for centuries faithful to the spirit of the 1581 Provincial Council. Idols might, however, survive if transmogrified into a sufficiently Christian form. Nowhere was this more striking than in what became the most famous shrine of the New World, that of Our Lady of Guadalupe outside Mexico City. There had been a temple of Tonantzin, Mother of the Gods, at Tepeyac, where, according to the Guadalupe tradition, a poor Indian named Juan Diego saw a vision of the Virgin Mary on 9 December 1531, asking him to have a chapel built in Tepeyac in her honor. 9 December is, of course, the day after the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. 1531 was barely 10 years after the Spanish conquest. Bishop de Zumarraga at first rebuffed Diego, but at the fourth apparition, the Virgin instructed him to pick the flowers growing unseasonably on the hill at Tepeyac, fill his cactus fiber mantle with them, and go thus to the bishop. When he opened his cape and the flowers fell out, a miraculous likeness of the Virgin was found imprinted upon it. The bishop was convinced, and the chapel was built. The Guadalupe story is extremely intriguing, not least because so little was made of it for over 100 years. Did it ever happen, or was it a 17th century invention? Only in 1648 did a remarkable book about it, written by a priest named Miguel Sanchez, suddenly make the Tepeyac image of Mary something which everyone knew about. Everywhere, chapels were dedicated to Our Lady of Guadalupe. At Tepeyac, a pilgrim highway to the sanctuary was constructed, and then a large new basilica. Archbishops, nuns, and canons vied with one another to do honor to the Virgin of Guadalupe until, in 1746, delegates of all the dioceses of Mexico united to proclaim her their universal patron. The image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is that of a young girl without a child standing on the moon, and in so many ways reminiscent of the woman described in chapter 12 of the Apocalypse. She seems to typify the concept of the Immaculate Conception, a devotion which developed more in 17th than 16th century Spain. Yet it seems that a shrine was already in existence at Tepeyac in 1554, and that the Nahuatl text of the story may have been composed by Antonio Valeriano, leading representative of the early college of Santa Cruz Tlatelolco. It is decidedly odd that the name of Guadalupe, that of an old Marian shrine in Spain, should have been given to one in Mexico, where the image, unlike almost every other such icon, was never claimed to have come from Spain, from the brush of St. Luke or wherever. Its claim from the start was to be Indian, imprinted on the cloak of the poorest of the poor. Its very Indianness and the obvious link with the local cult of Tonantzin could have made the Franciscans for long quite opposed to its acceptance. Here it could well be argued was only too clear a case of an idol reappearing in Christian form, something which did not accord at all with Franciscan theology, though it might fit with a Las Casas view that grace perfected rather than replaced the works of nature. In the 16th century, Our Lady at Tepeyac would have been too Indian for Spanish Creoles to identify with. 100 years later, they had no such problem. It had become their very own Spanish named Guadalupe. It was the canon professors at the cathedral and university who became its most enthusiastic supporters. Guadalupe/Tepeyac represented God's predilection for New Spain over Old Spain or anywhere else because it could be claimed, unlike every other image, this one came directly from the Virgin. Yet it was pointed out as well that Mexican Indians had pictures rather than script, so it was culturally correct that the Virgin should bring no message but a picture of herself, should give it to someone as poor as Juan Diego, and should place it on the absolutely Indian material of a piece of cactus cloth. Thus could Indian and Creole Christians be united in veneration of Our Lady of Guadalupe, if often in very little else. 1650 through 1780. Latin American Catholicism had, by the mid-17th century, acquired its enduring form, a form dominated by Creoles, although they still had to accept that most bishops came to them from Spain, as did governors and viceroys, and that the orders still saw it as their special role to protect and supervise the Indians. What had vastly diminished was the effective power of the monarchy together with the intellectual and spiritual strength of the Spanish Church. Spain at home was exhausted, worn down by wars, policy mistakes, and inadequate kings. The vitality of Catholicism, to be found in 16th century Europe, preeminently in Spain, was now located in France and elsewhere, countries cut off from influencing Latin America. The Creoles, on their side, had multiplied, beautified their towns and churches, distanced themselves psychologically from the peninsulares, new arrivals from Spain, and poured especially into the secular clergy, an attractive occupation when there was not so much else to do. No fewer than 1,325 secular priests and 1,080 religious processed through Mexico City at the exequies held for Philip IV in 1665. The overwhelming majority of the former were Creoles. It was to educate them that the religious orders kept opening new universities and colleges. The splendor of the Baroque churches of 17th century Mexico and Peru testifies to a religious culture anxious to outdo that of its mother country, yet still essentially dependent upon it. The Council of Trent had stressed that parishes should have parish priests, preferably from the secular clergy, fully subordinate to the diocesan bishop. Religious orders disliked being subject to local bishops. In early America, while the secular clergy had staffed the inner town parishes intended for Creoles, most of each diocese was divided into doctrinas, far larger areas which were devoted to the Indian apostolate. Each was entrusted to a priory or Jesuit house where no individual was specifically named as parish priest. The religious, most of whom came from Europe, regularly preached and taught in one or another Indian language. As the number of Creole secular clergy increased, the bishops took over the less remote doctrinas and broke them up into parishes, thus apparently implementing Tridentine regulations and strengthening their own diocesan control. One result could be the replacement of the Indian language by Spanish, for few Creoles bothered to learn the former. The ecclesiastical marginalization of Indians was further enhanced. When the Indians of the pueblo of Zapotlan in western Mexico complained in 1799 that their priest would only bury non-Indian newcomers in the churchyard of their own village, and that moreover the church bells were not rung for any Indian, they were protesting about a basic lack of shared identity between priest and people. Nevertheless, as lower-class Creole and mestizo diocesan priests multiplied, they too could become part of Indian society, and almost more completely than any religious, because many were poorer and more on their own. The two outstanding leaders of the Mexican peasant rising of 1810 through 15, Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos, were both priests, Hidalgo a Creole, Morelos a mestizo and former mule driver. The orders of friars were caught in the middle of what was ostensibly more a struggle between Creoles and Peninsulares than between Creoles and Indians. There were many hundreds of Franciscan, Dominican, and Augustinian Creoles who felt that the control of their orders remained in the hands of newly arrived Spaniards. Eventually, the alternativa had to be adopted, a rule whereby every position of importance alternated between Creoles and Peninsulares. While this arrangement betokened a loss of missionary fervor as the orders settled down into the inward-looking preoccupations of a colonial world only moderately prosperous, tied to medieval structures, and deprived of any final political control of its own affairs, which remained in the hands of Madrid and of viceroys coming from Madrid, that loss should not be overstated nor located too early. The Franciscans enjoyed a remarkable revival of missionary fervor in the early 18th century, noticeable particularly in Texas, but present in many parts of the Spanish Empire. That was mostly, but not wholly, a movement of peninsulares. The religious control of doctrinas in areas more remote from Creole settlement remained unchallenged, and that was where the Jesuits had concentrated their missionary endeavor. Their work was divided between running colleges in the towns and remote missions on the frontiers, where a Christian Indian society could be built up without Spanish, Creole, or even Episcopal interference. Separation had always been the missionary ideal, ever since the time of Matolinia and Las Casas. Indian life could only be preserved and Indians Christianized effectively if shielded from the destructive impact of colonialism. There was, in principle, little difference between the strategy of the Jesuits and that of the orders of the friars. The Jesuits were simply more ruthlessly consistent in carrying it out, while the friars were part and parcel of normal society subject to pressures from the crown. The tensions between Creoles and Peninsulares and much else, the Jesuits never faltered in the absoluteness of their centralized control and never hesitated to expel members who in any way failed to perform satisfactorily. Their international character probably increased as time went on, including Germans, Italians, and Flemings, as well as Spaniards from Europe. This did not at all mean that their ranks did not include Creoles, for they had a great many, including the cream of well-educated colonial society. It did mean that as an institution they remained apart, frequently in tension with the bishops as well as with the state, not least because of their considerable wealth. Their agricultural estates far exceeded those of any other order. It was wealth, they claimed, needed for the maintenance of their many colleges. The Jesuits are remembered, nevertheless, mostly for their frontier missions, above all in Paraguay. The latter was only one of many important areas in which they were at work: Lower California, Minas east of Quito, much of northern Amazonia in Portuguese territory, as well as the most extensive area of all, Paraguay. While their methods were everywhere much the same and not so different from those of the Franciscans, the degree of success greatly varied, depending on their ability both to get the Indian population to adopt a sedentary village life and to hold at bay the intrusion of slave traders and royal administrators. East of Quito, they largely failed. In Paraguay, among the Guaranis, they succeeded in what became one of the most remarkable of missionary enterprises. It began in 1603. Little by little, bands of Jesuits advanced unarmed and alone into the forest areas, often entering a village in procession, carrying aloft cross and painted boards. Here the sort of entirely pacific conversion championed by Las Casas was shown to be possible and with time extremely successful. The crown forbade any other Spaniards to enter the area, but Portuguese slave traders from Sao Paulo began to do so, devastating the mission villages. The Jesuits then obtained permission from Madrid to arm their converts and build up a well-disciplined militia able to provide adequate protection. By the 18th century, the missions of Paraguay included over 100,000 people living contentedly in villages whose ordered life was a combination of agricultural work, crafts of many sorts, and a complex liturgical cycle including a great deal of music. In comparison with the fate of Indians elsewhere, the reductions of Paraguay represented something not far off paradise. But it remained a captive Christianity in which the leadership was provided by the most dedicated of outsiders. Here, as everywhere else, the failure of the mission lay in the lack of any local clergy, a lack rendered almost inevitable by the law of celibacy and the insistence upon a knowledge of Latin. In Paraguay, as in Mexico or Peru, the Indian church would have become far less vulnerable if it had had as local ministers its own Indian priests. But very few, even mestizos, were ordained before the 18th century. While Indians could be catechists in most of the missions and play an active role in the semi-independent religious life of confraternities in the cities, no fewer than 82 separate Indian confraternities took part in the Mexico City procession at Philip IV's death in 1665. These could not substitute for the absence of priests of their own. It is hardly surprising that in 1768, 1 year after the expulsion of the Jesuits from Spanish America, a royal ordinance stipulated that at least a quarter of the students entering the seminaries must be Indians or mestizos. Creole priests many unable to speak an Indian language could hardly replace the Jesuits in the full range of their achievement. Some, however, did their best, and Indian Christian life, as fostered by the Jesuits, had itself a far greater resilience than many commentators have recognized. If in Paraguay political pressures quickly decreased the population of the reductions after their expulsion in their Chiquitos mission in what became Bolivia, the endurance of the Jesuit legacy even now is what needs stressing. It had been a very holistic mission ever since it began in 1691 with the founding of San Xavier, to be followed by 9 further settlements, a mix of agricultural improvement, basic education, and religious celebration. Musical instruments, whose relics still survive, were imported from Europe. Some amazing churches were built. The human and religious were integrated, making the fullest use of Indian language and culture to create here, as elsewhere, a functioning Indo-Christian synthesis. What is remarkable is that this involved the successful unification of a number of ethnic and language groups, and that it survived the expulsion of 1767. The Chiquitenos continued to identify themselves through loyalty to the Santos Padres, so that a stranger could note, as late as the 1840s, how respectfully silent everyone fell when their memory was recalled. And the Creole secular priests who replaced them carried on the tradition as best they could. Thus the District Council of San Rafael wrote to the king in March 1791, "Our P. Gregorio means a lot to us. He knows our poverty, and so we want that he stays with us and dies among us." 2 remarkable Jesuits of the 17th century who were engaged in quite another sort of mission can lead us into a different area. In 1627, Alonso de Sandoval published a book entitled De Instauranda Ethiopium Salut, about the apostolate to African slaves. He and his assistant, Pedro Claver, worked indefatigably in the docks at Cartagena, where thousands of blacks were unloaded every year, often more dead than alive after their fearful Atlantic crossing. With a group of black interpreters picked to cope with the range of African languages needed, Sandoval and Claver ministered to the slaves materially and spiritually without stopping for more than 50 years. In his book, Sandoval denounced the abominable treatment of the slaves, listed the African peoples and languages they represented, while appealing to other Jesuits to join him in this work. He and Claver were undoubtedly 2 of the most heroically dedicated and saintly men religious history, even Jesuit history, can record. But in the wider context of the Latin American Church, they were indeed, even more than Las Casas, voices crying in the wilderness. While there was a vast apostolate to the Indians, there was little indeed to the ever-growing population of, often even worse treated, black slaves. One of the reasons was that the missionary orders already had their hands full with the one before the other had begun to develop. A second was that they had, as we have seen, largely decided that they could only work effectively by separating their flock from white interference. But it was of the essence of the slave condition that they were wholly subject to white power. A consequence was that while superficially the black population too came to accept en masse a coping of Christianity, its characteristic synthesis of old and new was far more coherently located, even organizationally, in a reworking of the traditional, in this case West African, side of the mix. Voodoo in Haiti and numerous Afro-Brazilian cults are the result. In Spanish America, however, it was only in Cuba, Hispaniola, and Venezuela, that a world consisting principally of black slaves and large slave-worked plantations really developed. Elsewhere, they tended to become integrated into the wider society. Already in the early 17th century, we saw the mulatto Martin de Porres at work in Lima. It was in Portuguese America that the multiplication of black slaves absolutely dominated the whole character of society. Brazil is basically a latecomer in our history. The 16th century Portuguese colonial interest lay in Asia. Brazil seemed at first to have little to offer, and Portugal's own resources of manpower were far more circumscribed than Spain's. In Brazil, they found none of the instant wealth of Mexico or Peru, nor indeed any at all advanced Indian society. Its attraction lay in the production of sugar. Sugar plantations required slaves. The Indians wilted, so it seemed easy enough for the Portuguese, who had forts along the West African coast and had already begun exporting slaves to Europe, to develop a massive transatlantic trade to build up the Brazilian economy. While the Jesuits arrived early in Brazil in 1549 and were followed by Franciscans, Carmelites, and Benedictines, they represented a European church which had little of the theological and spiritual brilliance of 16th century Spain. Here, as in Spanish America, if less pardonably, the orders concentrated on the Indians, unable to see how to tackle the problem of the black population, which in consequence was never systematically evangelized at all. Until 1676, there was but a single diocese at Salvador de Bahia. There was an isolation in Portuguese Catholicism far deeper than that to be found in Spain. The Portuguese Empire, and particularly its Brazilian wing, came to be permeated with a slave culture to an extent that the Spanish never was. Moreover, Brazil developed in population, economy, and extent far more in the 18th century, the heyday of the slave trade, by which time both the Spanish and Portuguese empires had entered economically into a somewhat stagnant period, with the sole exception of Brazil. The 18th century was, moreover, one in which the Portuguese church, too, had lost whatever missionary fervor it had earlier possessed. Almost everything dynamic that happened within the Brazilian church was done by the Jesuits, though they, too, were deeply involved in slavery, and their most distinguished intellectual, Antonio Vieira, attempted to justify it, despite his impassioned appeals against the oppression of the Indians. However, when the Jesuits were expelled from Brazil by Pombal in 1759, 8 years before their expulsion from Spanish America, there was no one to replace them. In Pombal's modernizing view, there was no room for the preservation of Indians as such. The only way to dominate a barbarous people, he declared, is to civilize it and establish a bond between conquered and conquerors, who will live in society under the same laws as one people without any distinctions. That is to say, as Portuguese. It was the policy which had already wiped out the Indians of the coastal areas. Not only were the Jesuits expelled, but the aldeias of the Franciscans, too, were taken from them and broken up into parishes to be run by secular clergy, where Tupi was replaced by Portuguese. The Jesuits had made plenty of enemies. The bishops resented their independence. Slave traders and owners of large plantations resented their protection of Indians from being dragged into the labor force. Lots of people resented their wealth, while the Spanish crown could be persuaded that in Paraguay they were creating an independent state. Yet the underlying reasons for their expulsion had more to do with Europe than America. Gallican hostility in France, Josephite hostility in Austria, a mounting wave of anti-clerical Enlightenment opinion linked with a new absolutism which allowed no place for any surviving power in the papacy. The Jesuits seemed to stand, and still too potently, for a system of religious absolutism, which accorded neither with rationalism nor with the state's supremacy as late 18th century modernizers understood them. In this, Pombal led the way in his expulsion of 1759, but in 1773, Pope Clement XIV would be compelled by the principal powers of Europe to suppress the society entirely. None of this was very popular in America. Indeed, their expulsion in 1767 from the Spanish territories produced violent protests across Mexico, involving both Creoles and Indians. The departure of 2,500 Jesuits, more than half of them Creoles, not only involved the effective collapse of a mission to the Indians in many frontier areas, it also removed the best education available for Creoles. If Europe's raison d'etre was responsible for this sudden destruction of the most high-minded and disciplined element within the colonial church, the revolutions of Europe 30 years later would produce even greater consequences for the upturning of the Catholicism of America. 1780 through 1900. Revolutions and reactions. The American Revolution of the 1780s had not gone unnoticed in the lands to its south. If the 13 colonies could throw off the rule of Britain, the most powerful and progressive of countries, why should Latin Americans not do the same? What had Spain, a land almost as underdeveloped as its colonies, to offer Creoles, except frustration with the imposition of peninsulaires into most senior positions and the ceaseless milking of its economy, the bullion trade above all, to pay for government in Madrid? The answer is clear enough. Creoles remained fearful of dropping the hand of nurse, for fear of finding themselves overwhelmed by something a great deal worse, the vast unwhite majority in their own lands. Perhaps 15% of the population of Spanish America could now claim to be white, but even in New Spain, Mexico, where immigration had been particularly high, of a population of 6 million, only 1 million were white. As the bishop-elect of Michoacan, Manuel Abad y Cuipo, declared in 1799, commenting on the division between Indians and Spaniards. There is the conflict of interests and the hostility which invariably prevails between those who have nothing and those who have everything, between vassals and lords. The extensive rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in Peru, beginning near Cusco in 1780, and then the even more bloody Black Revolution in Saint Domingue, Haiti to be. The French ruled half of Hispaniola in 1791 made it clear enough why Creoles did not feel too anxious to be free of the protective control of the mother country. The Napoleonic Wars, however, created a decisively different situation. While Spain was on the French side, the British fleet blockaded its ports and broke the commercial ties linking Spanish America to Cadiz. When, moreover, Napoleon invaded Spain and, in 1808, imposed his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, as King of Spain, provoking immediate civil war, the political ties were disrupted as well. The intellectual, economic, and political bankruptcy of a once great country was only too obvious, and it was inevitable that more and more Latin Americans should feel the urge to declare independence. There were still royalists in plenty, especially peninsulaires in positions of power, to put up a fight over the next 15 years. But by 1824, the whole Spanish-American mainland had achieved its independence. It would probably, in fact, have happened a good deal quicker if the Indians and mestizos of Mexico had not risen in revolt in 1810 under Hidalgo, seized control of much of the country, and massacred a good many whites, both peninsulaires and Creoles, especially in the storming of Guanajuato. That forced the mass of Creoles back for a while into the support of royalist legitimacy. When independence was achieved, it was essentially the victory of the Creole upper class, unwilling to tolerate any further the irritating oversight of Madrid, but no more willing to allow power to slip back into Indian, black, or mestizo hands. They had never constituted a single American colony and had little sense of being a single community. Loyalties were far more local than that, so a string of new republics from Argentina in the south to Mexico in the north made their appearance. Brazil moved less dramatically. By the start of the 19th century, it was already clear that Brazil was a far larger and more prosperous country than Portugal. When Napoleon invaded Portugal late in 1807, the royal family and entire government fled to Rio de Janeiro. When finally, in 1821, Leo VI returned to Lisbon under huge Portuguese pressure, the Brazilians were quite unwilling to lose the status they had had for 14 years and declared their independence with Leo's young son, Dom Pedro, as Emperor of Brazil. What influence had the church on the revolution, and what effect did the revolution at once have upon the church? One might, oversimplifying a little, classify the clergy into three classes, each parallel to the three forces at loggerheads in the revolutionary years. Most of the bishops and many of the religious were peninsulaires and royalists. They had been appointed by the king, and few could easily envisage any safe order of things other than one of throne and altar, even though the Bourbon kings of 18th century Spain had proved increasingly unhelpful to religion, expelling the Jesuits and endeavoring to seize the church's principal funds. Yet the old order was still basically in existence. Archbishops could still easily be appointed as viceroys in an emergency. The Inquisition still functioned to ensure the public orthodoxy of society. For most Spanish ecclesiastics, only too aware of what the consequences had been all across Europe for the church and religion of revolution in France, it was madness to encourage revolution west of the Atlantic as well. Upper-class Creole priests tended to see things rather differently. Many shared and even had sometimes inspired the more progressive aspirations of the revolutionaries. They could see no reason why they provided the cathedral canons of their diocese, but were so seldom chosen to fill the episcopal thrones. Essentially, they wanted a Creole church for a Creole state, a state which by ideologically adopting an American identity could claim that it was freeing non-white Americans as well as white. Yet the bottom line of their politique had been shown clearly enough at the most critical moment in the rising of Tupac Amaru II, when the Creole bishop Moscoso of Cusco had defended the city from his attack. While Tupac Amaru himself had been educated by the Jesuits and wanted an Inca state with Catholicism as its official religion, for many of his followers, the church and its clergy were simply part of a regime of Spanish land-owning oppression. Once the siege was over, Moscoso wrote to the tyrannical Visitor General, whose determination to increase the tax yield had led to the revolt. Moscoso denounced his flock in unmeasured terms for their obstinate adherence to pagan beliefs, Inca clothes, and even their own language. It had been disastrous, he remarked, to allow a collection of Inca imperial portraits to adorn the walls of the Jesuit college in Cusco. Everything should now be done to extirpate such uncivilized relics of the past, including even the use of native languages. There were, however, many other priests, both Creole and mestizo, who had lived with and worked for the non-white population, had seen how desperately ill-treated it was, and deeply sympathized with a far more radical reshaping of society than the Creole leadership could tolerate for a moment. More than 100 priests were executed in Mexico for supporting the rebellion of Hidalgo and Morelos. The 1810-15 war represents a prism for the exposure of all sorts of ambiguities, which it would take the rest of the century and more to sort out. It is part of the built-in tragic irony of Mexico's history that it has been able to identify the start of its War of Independence with Hidalgo's Grito de Dolores, the call to arms he muttered from the steps of his parish church on Sunday, 16 September 1810. It was an appeal to Indians and mestizos to follow him in the defiance of religion, the rejection of Spanish rule, and the righting of Indian grievances. The Virgin of Guadalupe was proclaimed guardian of the revolution, but the relationship to it of Creoles remained decidedly vague. Meanwhile, in Guadalajara, before it was captured by Hidalgo, the loyalist Bishop Cabañas was organizing a somewhat laughable Crusado regiment which he personally led out of the cathedral day by day, followed by mounted priests, sword in hand, while the lads who followed behind cried, "Long live the Holy Catholic Faith." Thus were the church, its symbols and clergy split down the middle. If many devoted Creole priests followed Hidalgo, few other Creoles did so. He was captured, hanged, and his head displayed above the city granary at Guanajito, where his bloodiest massacre had taken place. Yet he still became the father of independence, and 16 September, the date of his grito, Mexico's National Independence Day, while the republic which substantially represented those who had defeated him went on to overturn every ecclesiastical privilege in which Bishop Cabañas believed. The arrival of independence all across Latin America, a regime combining a basic social conservatism with some commitment to modernization, affected the church in a number of ways. Very few of the new political leaders were consciously anti-Catholic, but most took for granted the elimination of the more archaic elements within the ecclesiastical system. The Inquisition was abolished at once, but it took 50 years or more in some places before the juridical privileges of the clergy disappeared together with state collection of tithe. As Britain soon became the principal trading partner of most of these countries, it was important to allow freedom of worship for Protestants, but that too was slow in coming, as was an ending to the clergy's monopoly control of education. Most of 19th century church history can be written depressingly enough around a struggle over such issues, country by country. Despite a certain to and fro movement, including periods where conservative politicians upheld the church's more antiquated claims and even guaranteed them in concordance with the Vatican, Guatemala, 1852, Ecuador, 1863, Colombia, 1887, the church inevitably lost out in this sort of contestation. What is depressing is that the retention of these rights was for so long central to ecclesiastical preoccupation, while any concern for the rights of Indians and non-white majority is harder to detect. A sense of siege was actually enhanced by increasing links between the Latin American church and the European church, centered around the papacy in the long pontificate of Pius IX, 1846 through 78. Ultramontanism was something quite new for a church hitherto wholly controlled by the Spanish crown, but with the loss of both that control and the privileges that went with it, it was inevitable that the Latin American hierarchy should seek a new source of protection in the papacy, though it was a papacy at its most illiberal and itself most buffeted by the pressures of an unsympathetic new political order. The most immediate question, however, was how the Latin American hierarchy was to continue to exist at all. The kings of Spain and Portugal had been granted the right to make all episcopal appointments and were not at all disposed to forego that right. Equally, the new governments took it for granted that the royal patronato must pass to them. In consequence, no bishops were appointed for many years. The Diocese of Mexico was vacant. from 1824 to 1839, that of Buenos Aires from 1813 to 1833, that of Nicaragua from 1825 to 1849. When the Archbishop of Guatemala and the Bishop of Puebla both died in 1829, Central America and Mexico were left without a single bishop. The papacy was caught in a quandary. It was under pressure from both the government of Spain and other European governments not to recognize revolution by appointing bishops except as nominated by the King of Spain. Moreover, the conservative political sympathies of the papacy pressed it in the same direction. Yet, fortunately for the Latin American Church, Leo XII, 1823 through 29, appointed as prefect of Propaganda Fide Cardinal Capilleri, who, while intensely conservative in most other ways, had a quite exceptional commitment to reinvigorating and extending the non-European church throughout the world. On his advice, Leo declared that he would henceforth personally appoint bishops to vacant sees in Latin America and proceeded to do so at once for Colombia. The sharpness of the Spanish reaction caused him and his successor, Pius VIII, to pull back, but when Capilleri himself became pope, as Gregory XVI in 1831, the policy was resumed, though its implementation depended on the acquiescence of the governments of each Latin American country, whose right of nomination was soon implicitly, if not explicitly, admitted. The significance of this change in the control of the American hierarchy cannot be overestimated. It produced a new sort of episcopate, if one actually at times more politically intransient than its predecessor. An immediate effect of the hiatus between old and new was a sharp decline in the number of priests. In many places there were no ordinations for 20 years. A good many royalist priests had already retreated to Spain. Moreover, in the new republics, there were far more career opportunities for the educated Creole than formerly, in politics, the army, and commerce. Hence, the attraction of clerical life markedly declined. Furthermore, in several countries, the government imposed restrictions on entry into religious orders, so that their number decreased even more than that of the secular clergy. In consequence of all this, one of the characteristics of the modern Latin American church, an acute shortage of clergy, can be dated from this period. This ends part 2.